instance, as I told you, for this Smagorinsky model. LES is often used in application, and as I said, there are not only what I presented here, there are many models, but as far as I know, most popular is this Smagorinsky and some variants. And there are also some books. There is a very good book from the engineering point of view, and there are also 2 books from the mathematical point of view. The last part is on variational multiscale methods. This is a different approach how to simulate turbulent flows. We have seen that there are some mathematical issues in LES, in the definition of the large scales. And the goal of VMS is to define the large scales in a different way. And this is done by defining these scales by projections into function spaces. So it becomes more mathematical. And that's why the VMS schemes are not based as the LES on the strong form of the equations, which I showed you, but on the underlying variational or weak equations. And then quite often, but not always, in VMS, there's a second main property, namely that the model for the influence of the unresolved scales onto the resolved scales acts directly only on some resolved small scales. So that means, in contrast to LES, where we have a 2-scale decomposition of the flow, we have here a 3-scale decomposition. We still have the unresolved scales, that's clear, but the resolved scales are decomposed once more into large scales and to resolved small scales. And both of them should be simulated. And this idea cannot only be applied to turbulent flows, it can also apply to other multi-scale problems. There are 2 famous papers by Tom Hughes and Jean-Luc Guermont. Okay, and I will present here the 3-scale VMS. And here you see the variational form of the Navier-Stokes equations. You can see, where you can see here that integration by parts was applied to bring the gradient from the pressure to the test function and to bring the second order derivative here also to the test function. But this is not so important at the moment. To simplify notation, we write this equation into this form, and then we have this 3-scale decomposition into the large scales, resolved small scales, then unresolved scales, and we just insert this 3-scale decomposition here, and also the same decomposition for the test functions. And then one gets an equivalent form of this short equation, and this equivalent form is a coupled system of 3 equations. For the large-scale test functions, for the resolved small scales, and for the unresolved scale test function, and the ideas and assumptions are like this. One neglects the last equation because one does not have the unresolved scale test functions. One approximates this term by 0 by assuming that the unresolved scales have no direct impact on the large scales, and here one needs some turbulence model. And so that means one ends up with a simpler system of this form, and the parameters are like this. One needs the spacers for the large scales, spacers for the resolved small scales, and some turbulence model. And with respect to the turbulence model, in most publications you can find the Smagorinsky model. And I also like to mention that there are meanwhile different realizations of this VMS method. And I like to present shortly only one of them, where I also was involved in the development of this method. And here one needs standard finite element spaces for all resolved scales, and some space for the large scales, which is a space of tensor valued functions. And the system to solve looks like this. Again, the black terms are the terms from the Navier-Stokes equations, and the color terms are new. Here you can see this is a so-called L2 projection, and this projection defines the large scales, this G capital H. And here you see the difference between all scales and the large scales, and this difference are just the resolved small scales. And you see that this difference appears here again in this color term, and the turbulent viscosity acts directly only on the resolved small scales. So these are the 2 main properties of a VMS model. So as I said, there are 2 parameters, the space for the large scales and the turbulence viscosity. There, as I said, Smagorinsky type models are used. Also here one can perform finite element error analysis. So with respect to the space for the large scales, one can think about how to implement this method efficiently, and then it takes some calculations, but at the end one finds that one needs that the support of each basis function should be only one mesh cell and that the basis function should be L2 orthogonal. That means one should use discontinuous finite element spaces with spaces of piecewise Legendre polynomials, which is not complicated, so it's no big issue to implement this large scale space. We did a lot of simulations. I will present at the end one of them, and in this simulations we can either prescribe the projection space before by piecewise constant tensors, piecewise linear discontinuous tensor, or meanwhile we have also some approach where space is chosen adaptively on the local turbulence. So the problem which we considered is the flow around a cylinder, which you have seen at the beginning of the presentation. It's just this one. And so there's the flow around the body, which is also important for applications. And in applications, one needs something like lift coefficients and drag coefficients, which, for instance, the drag describes the force of the fluid that exerts it on the cylinder in the direction of the fluid, and the lift, the force orthogonal to the flow direction. And for turbulent flows, one needs mean values, or engineers are interested in mean values, temporal mean values, for instance. And then the root mean squared values, they describe the fluctuations around the mean values. And the Stroheim number describes the frequency of the vortex shedding. And then here are some results. We have some experimental data. This should be around 0. This is fine for all simulations. Here are some parameters for the adaptive algorithm I don't like to explain. Here for the root mean squared values, everything is in the experimental interval, but there are some differences between the a priori chosen projection spaces and the adaptive. The mean drag is too large, but it's also too large with other turbulence models. The root mean squared is fine, and the Stroheim number is also close to the reference value. So at least altogether the results are not too bad. Okay, I think this VMS is an attractive alternative to LES because this is my main point. It has better mathematical properties. And as I said, there are much more approaches than I presented here, and here you see also some names which are connected with these approaches. Last slide, a short summary. I hope I could convince you that the simulation of turbulence flows cannot be with standard approaches. One needs so-called turbulence modeling. And as you have seen in the grid sizes which one needs for standard approaches, one does not have these grid sizes today, and one will not afford them in the near or foreseeable future. So also in the next decades, I think one needs turbulence modeling. There was much progress in the last 2 decades. So the LES was further developed, the VMS methods were introduced, also other ideas like approximate deconvolution were introduced. But there are still, I would say, less answers than open problems. There are many, many open problems, for instance, with respect to the mathematical and numerical analysis. Then it's often quite hard to assess the accuracy of the solutions, and they are often not that accurate, and also computing times is a quite urgent point, because computing times are normally very, very long. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to close. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. So, next speaker is to go back into simulations as there are some variables, particularly the dynamic flows. Okay, now is open to questions.
Say at the moment who will win at the end.
If you please.
He's from the Department of Aerospace Engineering, IIT Bombay. Actually, he has received his PhD from the Institute of Science, Bangalore. And he is also a awardee of JRD Tata Fellowships and the Award Fellowship holder also. Before going to move into the IIT Bombay, he has worked as a scientist in the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center at Thiruvananthapuram. And his main research interests are to develop a CFD algorithm for compressible and incompressible flows computations and their applications in practical problems. Today he is going to speak on mainly on the computational challenges solving the systems of hyperbolic conservation laws. Professor Jason.
Thank you, Professor Gowda. And I would like to thank Professor Sasi Kumar Ganeshan and Devnath Pal to invite me and give me opportunity to share my experiences with all of you. I have too many slides. No need to look at each and every line of this. Just I create an occasion so that after the talk one can have a discussion of whatever you pick up from the slides. Basically, what I would like to convey as an overall is more important. My presentation goes like this. I'll be talking about 3 different topics, and just to highlight as to what are the challenges. There are many other problems also. I'll just point them out in due course. So, hyperbolic problems, although you have the initial data as continuous, but it soon develop discontinuities in the solutions. So it needs to satisfy several things in order to capture accurate solutions, like conservations. Just because if you want to ensure correct jumps and the locations, that's why you will find most of the formulations are finite volume, because conservations are the one on which it is based upon. Pointing is done so that you, in the discrete form itself, can take care of the propagation of signals, directions, and the speed. Also, it facilitates the positivity conditions, as you can see here, which is required for non-oscillatory solutions. And most of the schemes are dissipative in nature. The very first topic I'll take up. And you have to make sure that these discontinuities are captured within 1 or 2 grid points. It's a great challenge. And it should be non-oscillatory in nature. Oscillation is picked up by the because of the way it is formulated, which is undesired. So one need to impose positivity and monotonicity. And of course, to physically correct solution, one need to impose the entropy. In spite of taking care of so much of care, I will show you some example, 3 of them, where you will see that things are still far from perfections. The very first one is to achieve high resolutions in hyperbolic conservation law without having the wheels. So let's look at it, what exactly we mean by that. Basically, one need to have as high as possible, at least more than second order accuracy, because it has been found that many of the separated flows with vorticities where dispersion errors are dominated, second order accuracy is not enough. And unstructured hybrid grids are necessary if you really want to reduce the design cycle from many months to say hour or so. And anything you develop should be simple enough, should have minimum memory, and should be compact, in the sense it should use only the first neighbor. Otherwise, anything you do in the interior, you can achieve very high order accuracy, but when you go to the boundary, you'll have a problem interpreting the boundary conditions there. Present status is that no practical codes existing which is more than second order accuracy. They are at research level, especially for such regions that they are not simple and they are not compact enough. And a higher order scheme for unstructured grid basically suffers from severe accuracy and convergence problem that has actually stopped people going for higher order accuracy. And present formulations are too complex, for example, WNO and the compact scheme. That's why they remain at the research level and not used in the industry level so much. So if you just wanted to explain as to how do you achieve higher order accuracy in finite volume, as I said, finite volume is the way to go because you want to have conservations. Here, if you just put it in the finite volume form, that is integral form, you come up with a discretization of this. Here we are considering 3 points. This is the finite volume. One end is I minus half, another is I plus half. Fluxes are computed at these two faces, whereas the values are available at the end of it as an average value at the center. So you need to find the fluxes which are function of u, which is available here. So you need to find out from interpolation what are the values just left and right of this, which is called the reconstruction. Originally, the Godunov method is nothing but basically that finite volume only. At the end of it, you get the average value. What it does, given any initial condition, you just try to have the average and say piecewise constant values are there. So as a result, you have a Riemann problem at the interfaces and you solve it and get the solutions. But if you look at the results of this, if you have a uniform distribution, you have a very high dissipation. Any discontinuities will not be recognizable in practical case. But Van Lier, he found out that you can improve this accuracy by having a linear variation within the cell such that the average of that still gives you that the cell center values. So you can use backward difference, forward difference, central difference, or any least square. And depending on that, whatever you do, you will get a second order accuracy. But pure second order or higher order accuracy scheme will give you oscillations, and which can lead to failure also at times. So if you have linear variations, you can show very easily that after the space-time integration, you'll get an expression like this. And take different slopes. If you take slope 0, you get first order, central, Fromm, Weymouth, and Laxmander. These are well-known second order scheme. And if you look at the results, all of them have the oscillation, pure second order. So if you look at it, the first order has diffusion, no oscillation, and second order add anti-diffusive part. So these are responsible for higher order accuracy, at the same time responsible for oscillation. So a third order, you can have quadratic and so on. So we have to look at how this anti-diffusive term can be controlled so that you can get oscillation-free solutions. So this is based on what is called the Harten-Harman-Lax theorem, which says how to impose the monotonicity for linear scheme. Most of the schemes are linear, where this application of this says that all this coefficient has to be non-negative. So if you look at all those schemes I just talked about, they can be monotone only if they are first order. So this was too discouraging and theorem. So it took quite some time to understand and how to bypass this. So one way to do it is that make the scheme nonlinear. This theorem is not applicable there. Thereby you have a possibility of getting monotonicity preserving scheme, and that is the basis for all the higher order scheme today. So this is nonlinearity is introduced broadly 3 different ways. One is TVD. So here what you do, instead of linear, you make this part which is responsible for antidiffusivity as a nonlinear by multiplying a function which is a function of solution. So product term will be nonlinear, and thereby you can see that green line, you can have very crisp higher order solutions without having oscillations. So one example is that take Van Alverda. They use actually backward and forward slope comparison to identify, it's sort of a sensor, and you use it such a way that you get the TVD. Of course, you impose the TVD conditions there. So if this term become nonlinear, thereby it has the possibility of nonlinear, this non-oscillatory. Another thing, non-linearity is very natural because the way SOC is formed is also non-linear. So apart from signal propagation, the non-linearity also should be imitated as it is in the physics. So on uniform grid, you can get an expression like this. I'll just come back to it a little later. So another way of introducing nonlinearity is ENO or WNO variation of that. So in this, if you want to have a interpolations at this phase from the cell center values, you have choice of either P1, P2 or P3 polynomial. You can see that anything across the discontinuity is having an oscillation. So if you take it from the smoother part of it, you are likely to avoid that oscillations. That is the basic idea, and WNO takes a weighted way. And so every time step you choose this polynomial in a nonlinear fashion. That's how the nonlinearity comes into picture. Other way is the one developed by our group, is that it is based on least square, where we put the weighted least square, so that weight, if we make it solution dependent, it will be nonlinear in natural way. Another reason is that we wanted to go for unstructured, so least square gives an easy way to go for it. So just to explain it, that this is the reconstruction where we have to find this derivative, and we find it from expanding the solution from this and this, 2 equations, one unknown over determined system, and put the weights, you weighted least square. Now you have this part, you can make it nonlinear just if you put the weight as solution dependent. So what are these weights is the question. So if you just to get a clue, you write it on a uniform grid and just look at the TVD scheme, and you can see this is W1, W2, W1, W2, or you read it in another way, these are the W1, W2. So you can get a clue from here, and for this Van Alverda equivalent, you can get these weights. Now, out of these 2 choice, we use this because this gives us a way to go for, like this is developed for 3-point tensils. So we want to go use more number of tensils, and at the same time want to go to multi-dimension easily. Mind that TVD is not there for multi-dimensions. So if we want to go, we take this form. And so these are the things least square have. The ability to take larger tensile, non-uniform grid, unstructured in multi-dimensions. So question is, how will be the behavior if we have a larger tensile, non-uniform or multi-dimension? That is the thing I'm going to answer now. So if we look at the weight, look at the interpretation of this weight. So we call it influence coefficient. So what it does, while deriving the derivative here, these weights can be seen as an influence of this point in defining the derivative over here. It is nothing but the reciprocal of the differences between these 2 points. Similarly, this is the reciprocal of the difference between these 2. These are the way it influences the derivative calculation there. So, and we put epsilon here to avoid division by 0 when uniform flow is there. So now look at the interpretation. Suppose you have a discontinuity here, there will be a large jump here. So W2 will be almost 0, and it will compute the derivative only from the smoothest part of it. It is just like the ENO. Sort of one way you can say WENO. So now if you want to take another points here, you can do that. And here the difference is like difference between the solution between these two reciprocal of that. And you can go ahead and do it. You can show that this is also will be non-oscillatory in nature. So taking it farther, you can do it for 2D or 3D. You can compute least square with a weighted least square. 3 weights you can define here. One for this, one for this, and this. And again, the difference in the solution between these 2 points can be used at the weights in this same manner. Or there are many more, you can see it in this paper. And these give us non-oscillatory solutions. You just see the results. Here, Euler solutions, so anything beyond this SOC structures, there will be SOC boundary layer interactions. So the later part, the Euler solutions are not very accurate. You see the beginning part of the leading edge part of the Onera M6 swing, very crude grid. You can see almost matching with the experimental data, and you will see only 3-level adaptation, solution adapted grid, with starting with more number of grid points only are able to give these solutions. So just to compare TVD with SDWLS, that is one of the best limiter. You can see here this radial blast problem kind of thing. Here it should be perfectly symmetric, whereas because of some arbitrariness in the limiters, you will get a petal shape of this. Now, if you want to compare with the WNO, so we just applied to the level set thing here. We apply swirling kind of velocity once clockwise and then anti-clockwise, so that when it comes back, we will see whether it is just getting back to the same shape or not. So you will see this is the kind of velocity field applied in a forward and reverse manner. You can see that there is a loss of mass here. So if you look at this solution, second order itself is quite improved compared to third order ENO. And third order is almost same as the fifth order. Another thing to be noted, WNO3 has this SDWLS works on the first neighbor. This has a neighbors and then neighbor of neighbor. This has two or three more neighbors all the sides. So they will be really having problems at the boundary, whereas this has no problem at the boundary, almost getting the same accuracy with the third order. So, so many more results are there. Incompressible also flow, although shock waves are not there, and give fantastic results. So I'll just go and touch upon the next problem. That is, there are some catastrophic failure of best methods which are in use today because of what is called numerical shock instability. You know that very high speed flows, they all use Appoint method. I just said why. And they seems to fail for many ways. One is called carbuncle. This is supposed to be ideal solution. If you have a grid elongated in the radial direction, you'll see this is the Rose method, has a distorted shape. This is called carbuncle. This is HLLC. These are the best, most accurate method. And then there are a method like AUSM plus, and I think almost all the methods which are very popular fail spectacularly for certain grid situation. And there are Fourier expansion, spurious expansion takes place Rose case. You can correct it by entropy corrections, but then there are problems at these places. You can see that. And then odd even decoupling, that is a planar shock moving in the channel. if you just create an undulation in the grid only, no perturbation otherwise, as it moves along this, it gets degenerated. So all these good methods get into this problem called odd-even decoupling. Then there are some, they suffer from what is called the kink, as well as this triple spurious points are seen there. So for complex flow structures, you don't know. These are the simple case where we know what the solution should be. In complex sock intersection, you will be uncertain, and since the hypersonic flows cannot have experimental testings, it makes it even more unreliable. So most of the time, in fact almost all the time, you will see those which can resolve all the wave structure are the one which suffer, especially the one which exactly capture the contacts. And it is because of it can occur, otherwise they will give very good results. Only certain situation you can see here correct results, and when you resolve the grid in a particular manner, it can show very bad results. You will be surprised. You might think that if you put more viscosity, you might get a better results. It is the other way. You can see that second order has less intensity of instability than the first order method. And also it is due to the Euler, because if you have a higher Reynolds number, it shows up, low Reynolds number, it doesn't show up. So this goes against the intuition what one has. So it is very difficult to explain. Even now it is not completely understood. Now we are talking about exact capturing of contact. Why? Most of the practical problems like ignition front, shear layer, slip in shock interaction, vorticity, entropy layer in hypersonic, material interface, all are interplay of contact. So contact is the one most important. Even for viscous computations, you need to have proper contactability. So I put them into three categories. One is flux difference, flux vector spreading. They are not designed to be wave-wise resolving, so they are not good for such physics. And so flux difference splitting are the one which are good, and all of them suffers except for the new one what we have developed, and another one in developed in 2006 or so. But we found it having non-monotonic solution at higher order case. And there are other called hybrid point scheme. They initially started with the claim that they can avoid this, but they also found to have this problem. So there are many ways people try to have a cure. None of them are satisfactory, and I'll not go into that. So this is the one which we developed in 2012, found to have been able to resolve this against all the interpretation given by the people. So we are looking into theoretical aspect of it as to why it is working. So how we went ahead, just a personal experience, not very theoretical explanation. So if you look at 1D point of view, it's an Euler equation. This is field vector, flux vector, and flux vector, if you take it completely and try to have the contact through HLL scheme with contact or row scheme, then I call it unsplit flux vector. Another is the AUSM, AUFS kind of method. So what we did some numerical, we observed and also did our self-numerical experiment, and seen that, say, let's say odd-even decoupling problem. This is the ideal case, and you will see unsplit, the other one, even rows, I don't have the figure, they are the most sufferer, and this intensity of instability goes down as you use the convective pressure split kind of thing. Another example is this. These two are unsplit, these two are convective pressure split, and you can see that gradually these intensities are going down. It seems convective pressure splitting have some kind of a stability, inherent stability into it. And between these two schemes, this suffers more. This is almost nil. You will see the pressure, convective term is same, pressure term is differently treated. So we thought, why not do it even differently than what has been done by them? So we took the HLL way, which is supposed to be the robust, but then we want to recover the exact ability of the contact. So we went ahead like this. We had a convective pressure split part. This is published in this. So convective part is more or less same as the other, and pressure part, we just apply HLL scheme, and if you write central plus dissipation, you can write this dissipation are the one where we look at, and and we try to change it with this definition, and here you can show that they will be exactly capturing the contact. You can see the contact is exactly captured, and compared to HLLC, because they are the more or less similar accuracy, you can see that all these are taken care of in all the cases. So I'll just 2 minutes more. The third problem is the genuinely multidimensional. Here the major problem in finite volume is that you always solve a Riemann problem taking it to be one-dimensional. The other dimensional effect is not taken care here while doing it. So very recently, earlier efforts were all not giving very good results, but very recently Balsara came out with an approach where he could take care of the multidimensionality very easily. So first he applied to HLL scheme, but it has no contact capturing ability. Then he introduced, extended to HLLC, but led to very complex formulations. So this is 2D Riemann problem at the interface, 1D Riemann problem, and then integrate all over the face. That is the approach. So this is the kind of a wave structure, really multidimensional wave structure he takes care. Only thing, instead of elliptical, he takes it as a squarish. It can be improved later on, of course. So here, actually, you take it for two-dimensional problem, it become a 3D problem in space-time, whereas conventional one, you have a 2D in a space-time. So that's the difference. So, just 1 minute. I'll just define this and leave it there. So in this, because you have taken 3D space-time, so while working out a flux through a space, you are actually involving the other directions here. So if you see that flux in the x direction has the flux in x as well as y, similarly for this. So in this, the major problem is the interface. I don't know how. Major problem is because it is a 3D, you don't know the orientation, what way to fix. So Balsara recently, what he did, he just changed the formulation. He came out with a symmetric variable. But in our case, we don't need to fix this one, because we have done convective pressure splitting, convective part taking care of the contacts. And we fix the accuracy by just manipulating this. So I'll just go straight away to the results, one results only. So Rene-Schulz problems we have applied, and you can see that spectacular results here as compared to Balsara 1. Even it is as good as the third order, where all these contacts are very accurately captured. Another problem also. Basically, we have just talked about 3 issues here. There are many more issues like what do you call, treating the source term, MHD, and low Mach number flow. And there are many things where you need to, present algorithms are grossly not sufficient to capture the physics properly. Thank you so much for the attention.
This also.
He is involved in the research contracts in country and outside. And he is the one person taking the mathematics to the industry. He is the unstructured finite volume solvers. It becomes an industry CFD solvers. It is called the HYPHN, which is extensively used by the Indian industries. He is also a founder director of the SN Ride, that is a technology company specializing in CFD development and services. Okay. I welcome you to give a talk on
Mr. CFD. Thank you, Chairman. I want to specifically thank both Professor Shashi and Paul for giving me this opportunity. Of course, I would also like to thank the audience for being here almost towards the end of the day. So what I'm going to be talking about is the meshless CFD in aerospace engineering. I sort of, in fact, Shashi, when he had invited me, had indicated that it's going to be a mixed audience. So I've tried my best not to put in any equations in the presentations except for few view graphs. And I had to do that because I find that those equations are my language. I think we had a presentation on the language. Okay. However, I can assure you that I have used those equations to communicate something, not to hide something. Okay. So because I think that also she was talking about. She's not there. She has left. But this is part of our language. Now, of course, CFD is computational fluid dynamics, and the two of the speakers who have talked before me have made my job easy by sort of already giving you an introduction to what CFD is, computational fluid dynamics is. So what I'm going to talk about is slightly different in the sense that I'm going to emphasize on the kind of requirement the industry has in using the CFD as a tool for analysis and design. And of course, the overview is presented here. I will introduce you the meshless solver when I am going to do that. Now, basic question we start with is, when we say industrial CFD, computational fluid dynamics, what are all the expectations the industry has from CFD? They want a robust and an accurate solver. I think Professor Mandar had very nicely highlighted that this robustness and accuracy, they do not actually go together. They are always at loggerheads. If you want robustness, actually you actually lose out on the accuracy. And if you want accuracy, you actually lose out on the robustness. So when you want to solve a problem, industrial problem in aerospace design and analysis, you want both of them together. However, I would insist that between robustness and accuracy, robustness is more important. Robustness is more important because at the end of your CFD process, you want some numbers. Okay. However, you would like to sort of enhance the accuracy of those numbers that you have got. The second part of it, the challenge as far as the industrial CFD is concerned, is that CFD comes with a baggage of errors, the modeling errors, which the first speaker, Professor Walker, was talking about. Turbulence is a difficult problem. It's not possible numerically, even with the kind of petascale computing that we are actually talking about, it's not possible for us to resolve all the scales in turbulence. And therefore, what we do is to sort of say that, look, there are certain small scales which I'm going to model. So when I'm saying modeling, modeling can actually come from some kind of a fertile imagination and understanding of the physics of the problem. And that brings with it its own baggage of errors. And we need to sort of live with these errors because we want to solve the problem of today. The third one, which is more relevant as far as what we are going to see today, is that complex geometries. The geometries, the industry geometries, have been complex. They are growing more and more complex. And when you really talk about aerospace design, people have been trying to mimic as exactly as possible the, say, for example, the aircraft configuration. Right? So I think that's a challenge. And finally, at the end of the day, it should be efficient. So when I say efficient, your process should be efficient in the sense you have to sort of generate those design data in times acceptable to the designer. I think that's what efficiency means. And scalable in the sense that we have today the HPC platforms. We are talking about several thousand cores in computing, and CFD is one area which has actually challenged the HPC development over maybe last few decades. So the solvers should be in a position to sort of exploit the kind of scalability the machines offer. So to summarize, I would say, what are all the keys? The key is that we need to have reliable data in an acceptable time frame. And finally, industry does not want too many people working on the CFD. I'll also give you some examples. Lesser human intervention, lesser user intervention, and now slowly the industry is actually moving towards a regimen where the CFD process is automated. If I'm talking about a CFD process, what it means is that right from the time I start building my surface, generate the grid, discretization, breaking up my volumes, or breaking up my computational domain into so-called non-overlapping volumes or elements, solve the flow, then post-process the solution. So the entire process, the industry wants it to be done in an automated way with very little of human intervention. So that's where I think that these are the things which actually puts the meshless solvers in some context. So this is an example of what a complex geometry is. So this is an F16 configuration, like an F16 configuration, and it's fully loaded. You can see that it's a very, very representative configuration, and typically the grid size could be over 100 million volumes. Okay, and it's a fairly complex geometry, and a lot of effort actually goes in terms of generating grids for such geometries. If you want to really typically fix some kind of a time that's associated, during the early 90s, when the kind of technology that we are talking about were evolving, it could take few weeks. And today, we have much better tools for modeling the surfaces, generating the grids. So possibly, you may have your grids in a matter of days instead of weeks. So this is one area where we need to sort of look at, find out if there is something that we can do. This is another example. This is when I'm saying it's a complex geometry, this is what typically a high lift wing, when an aircraft is landing with all the slats and the flaps deployed. That's what it means, high lift wing. Actually, most interestingly, this is not just complex in terms of geometry, but it's also actually complex in terms of physics. And what you see here are some kind of brackets which actually hold the so-called main element with the flaps. And this is particularly a transforming some kind of an experimental setup into a CFD model. So you also have what are called as the pressure tube bundles, which are used in the case of the experiments for taking the pressure taps. So now, so this is one of the geometries that was very recently considered in a workshop. Here the volume, the grid size is about 165 million volumes. So I'm just telling you this because to give you the kind of magnitude of the problem that's actually faced in an industry. And this process of grid generation is extremely human intensive. And if you really talk about an industrial process where you have less of human intervention, more of an automated process, definitely you should look at something like the meshless solver. So what is this meshless solver? One thing that distinguishes the methods like this, the finite volume method, is that you need to sort of discretize the domain into volumes. So in this particular case, you see the tetrahedral volumes, and you have so-called structured multi-block grids. This could take almost about a month time for generating even a grid of this kind, which possibly may promise much better accuracy. what we talk about meshless is sense, we do not have in a very classical sense the discretization of the computational domain. All that we say is that we want distribution of points instead of volumes. And in fact, there are certain interesting observations anybody would, who wants to sort of look at these methods would make. If I am looking at the finite volume methods and the meshless solvers, in terms of the origin, I think they are more or less at the same time. In fact, like you can also have some work from mathematics, which is before 1979, and as far as the meshless solvers also, it's also true that some people possibly would have looked at it from the mathematics point of view, but purely from an engineering point of view, I would say that they had the origins almost at the same time. Now, if you ask the question, where does the finite volume stand vis-a-vis the meshless solvers? Almost, if you see all the industrial computations, it's all pervaded by the finite volume kind of approach. And I do not really see the meshless solvers. So when I'm talking about meshless solvers, I also want to make a distinction. This is different from the so-called Lagrangian methods like the LBM. So here still we are talking about an Eulerian framework. So we need to ask the question, so what has really prevented the meshless solvers in these almost about 3 decades from being routinely used? So if it is not being used, very obvious question is that it should have been forgotten. Okay, but it's also not the case. As recently as 2010 and 2011, you still have some good publications coming out on this particular topic. So in some sense, the interest is not lost, but at the same time, we do not really see these solvers manifest in a way one would have expected, particularly considering that these methods were born in along with the unstructured mesh finite volume methods. Now, another important question that always bugs when you really look at the meshless solvers is that people always talk about mesh for meshless solvers, because when you develop the algorithms for the meshless solvers, invariably the kind of point distribution are obtained from the normal grids, which otherwise you would have used for the finite volume method. So this is something which needs to be answered. The way we do that is that we project these meshless solvers as a Cartesian grid method. I'll tell you what this means is this means. And when I talk about a Cartesian grid method, one of the major advantages is that it lends itself for an automated CFD process. I think that's very, very important. Looking at Cartesian grid method, what it means is that I have a body which looks like this. I have a Cartesian domain. I subtract the body from this discretized Cartesian domain. What remains is my grid. It's as simple as that. And of course, this idea is not new. This has been quite extensively used in the context of the finite volume methods. When I'm talking about the finite volume methods, you are left with what are called as the small cut cells. And handling these cut cells can be actually a challenge in the finite volume methods. On the contrary, when I'm really talking about something like a meshless solver, I have distribution of points, and therefore my job in principle is easier. I would say that in principle is easier. Not just that, when I'm really talking about solving a turbulent flow problem where I have modeled the effect of turbulence, it's called as Ran's Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations. Particularly handling the interface between the kind of viscous padding I would like to add in order that I resolve the turbulent boundary layer, and the potential region I would have the Cartesian point distribution. So this interface handling can be much easier when I'm having something like a meshless solver. So this is what motivated us to tell that, look, the meshless solvers should be looked at as a Cartesian grid method, in the sense that the kind of point distribution that you need for the meshless solvers should effectively come from a Cartesian gridding strategy. Now, I have only equations only in 2 view graphs. I want to tell you that this is an extremely simple principle, like the curve fitting. So you have in 1D a discrete domain. the values of the function f are available at these locations, the discrete locations. All that we need to do, as we do in the case of the curve fitting, is that you have an estimate of the functions written in terms of a Taylor series, and these function values themselves are available at these discrete locations. Define an error, minimize the squares of the errors, and you have an expression for the derivative. So the issue is as simple as that. And of course, we can easily demonstrate that if I have a linear fit, I have first order approximation for the derivative, and if I have a quadratic fit, I have a second order approximation for the derivative, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to solve sorry, this is not working. Yeah, I want to solve the conservation equations, right? So essentially the idea here is that I require this derivative to be approximated by using something like a least squares problem, least squares procedure that I just now described. But only distinction is that these problems are hyperbolic. There is a very definite direction in which the information propagates, and therefore we need to bring in what is called as upwinding. Professor Mandel actually had given a brief introduction to that. So what it means effectively in terms of the methodology, the so-called least squares based finite difference method, is that you cannot actually be working with the solution values at the nodes, but as far as the fluxes are concerned, we need to introduce what are called as fictitious interface and use the upwind fluxes computed at these interfaces for in your least squares formula. So I think that's the broad methodology. And when I am really talking about the 2D, the issues are more or less the same. Only difference being that upwind we actually sort of it's one-dimensional. Upwinding is one-dimensional, so you do not have a generic representation for the divergence of the fluxes which you have here. So you need to calculate the flux along the direction along these rays, and these are the directional fluxes which are shown here. And when I have the directional flux, again I can define a least squares problem exactly the same way. But now in this case, I would instead, I would not just have an approximation for the gradients of the fluxes, namely fx and gy, but I would end up with 3 parameters in my least squares problem, right? And of course, like you solve this least squares problem and get your derivatives and use this for your solution update. And of course, when I'm talking about this, there are accuracies at 2 levels. One is at the level of defining the fluxes on the interface, and the other one is at the level of the least squares problem itself. And you can show that the fluxes at the interface have to be determined at least to second order accuracy in order that the least squares derivatives are consistent. And of course, a suitable time integration procedure, implicit procedure, should have to be made use of in order to make the least squares procedure, the meshless procedure, attractive in terms of computational time. And one of the important reasons, so till now whatever I have talked about are more about handling the part of the fluxes which do not involve the viscosity. So when I have the viscous discretization, because I know that my conservation equation also has a viscous term, when I include viscous terms, what happens is that from a geometry which is essentially 1D, you end up in a problem of conditioning of the matrices. Okay, the condition numbers could be pretty high. These matrices could almost be singular, and therefore, in fact, this possibly must have been one of the reasons why this method actually did not take off as compared to its finite volume counterpart. And what we do is we sort of use some kind of a rotated difference scheme if I'm talking about a point O here and its news neighborhood N, E, S, and W, we appropriately fix a rotated differencing framework and find out the derivatives along these xi and eta directions and rotate it back to the physical coordinate that we are actually working with. So this has helped us quite a bit in obtaining the so-called RANS solutions using the meshless solver. And what you see out here is the MDA 3-element airfoil. This is one of those standard test cases that we actually deal with when we want to really solve a complex problem at a 2D level. Only one important aspect that I would actually highlight is that in the case of the finite volumes, they very naturally take care of the folding of the grid lines, which you actually see at sharp corners. But in the case of the meshless, you need to sort of pad these sharp corners by introducing some kind of a pre-adaptivity of the point distribution that you have from the grid, which is very, very important for the success of this procedure. But when you do it, you do have very good numbers. What you see here is the pressure distribution, which is very important in terms of computing the loads on the wing. And here you have comparison of the velocity field. In fact, you have comparison not just with the experiments, but also with the finite volume solver, solutions from the finite volume solver. And this is at a location somewhere on the main element, and this one, the second one, is on a location somewhere on the flap. And you can very clearly see that there is a wake from the slat, which is seen out here and which is captured pretty accurately by the methodology. And when you are on a flap, there are two wakes, one corresponding to the main element and the other one corresponding to the slat. And of course, the art of building a multi-element airfoil is to sort of turn the flow by using these confluent boundary layers, which otherwise are not expected to sort of interfere with the bodies downstream. And of course, such shear layers are known to sort of negotiate pressure gradients more effectively. Shear layers hanging in the air are known to more effectively negotiate the pressure gradients as compared to the wall-bounded flows. So what I want to tell you through this view graph is that the method works pretty well. And this is a case of a Vajayv cylinder. So I'm really talking about a higher Mach number. Last time it was 0.2, and now I have about Mach 2. And these are the kind of pressure distribution on the body from the experiments and the finite volume method and also the meshless. You can see that all of them are together. I'm not sure whether this figure is seen. Was I seen it? Anyway, it's okay. And this is again an example of an automated CFD process. Typically, CFD is used for optimizing the flap positions, okay, both the landing and the takeoff configurations. So it necessitates putting your flap at different positions. It may have to be translated, rotated, and this is an example where the designer would want the CFD process to be completely automatic. So here we have an example where the points are generated automatically for every given flap position. The solutions are generated automatically, and you can sort of very effectively use meshless solvers for such optimization problems. And here you have a solution. Of course, I would like to sort of emphasize that these are not unsteady solutions. Rather, these are steady solutions at different flap positions. And the last example which I would like to give is the store trajectory prediction. This is again one example where the designer would want everything to happen automatically. You have a wing of a combat aircraft. There is a store. The store has to sort of safely separate from the wing. Okay, you can end up in a scenario where this store can actually sort of tumble and possibly hit the parent body itself. So you do not want such a scenario to occur. So this is again a classical case of a automatic CFD process. what are all the processes involved? One is that the store position has to be determined by using the so-called 6DOF simulator, the 6 degrees of freedom simulator. Then for a given, then the body has to be moved to that position. The grids have to be generated automatically. Then the flow is solved. The loads on the store are computed. These store data, the aerodynamic data or the loads on the store are fed back to the 6DOF simulator. 6DOF simulator would find out the new position of the store. This is a complete automatic, it's a complete process that has to be sort of simulated. And what you see out here is the store at different positions and the grid corresponding to those positions. So there is a 1 minute. I think I know the trick. Yeah. There is a simulation. There is a movie where you can see the. I think it's taking it. Yes, I see that. Right. So you can see that the store, in this particular case, separates pretty safely from the wing. So again, what you have here is a comparison of the linear displacements in the x, y, and z directions as computed by the meshless solver as against what you have from the experiments. In the experiments, these are also tricky experiments. You have what are called as captive trajectory system, specialized tunnels, where such store separation studies are conducted. You have an excellent comparison till about 0.5 seconds. And this is the angular displacement, right? So now, so this is about the ability of the solver. And what is the way ahead? If you really ask the question, is a 3D RANS capability is complete? I should remark that, for example, the store separation studies, it was more of an InVisit study, not a RANS study. 3D RANS, yes, it continues to be. 2D RANS, we have sorted out the problem. 3D RANS continues to be a challenge, and we need to, definitely address this particular issue if we need to keep this methodology. So to the interest of the designers, the design community, and of course there is also an issue of the conservation. Formally, the conservation of this methodology is not proven. However, I would say that if I'm really looking at a numerical method, this consistency and stability, the mathematical properties are very important, and therefore, at least in the subsonic domain, you have a whole lot of problems which can actually be handled, even if I presume that the conservation is not proven. But however, it's a very good idea to sort of look at this issue of conservation. It's not just an engineering issue. I would say that this issue could also be a mathematical issue to look at. So I stop here. I have my email out here, and thank you. In case I would like to take some questions if there are. For this kind of problems, the quasi-steady simulation is found to be adequate. I think the cycle is presented here, but I'm not sure. Thank you.
So the final speaker of this professional Tazo Discovery is from Union Science. And he was a postdoc in the role, the University of Massachusetts.
Slides.
And he has received many awards. I can just Academic Excellence Award, Engineer Award, and the NASA Super Scientist Award, and also Dr. A.V. Ramarao Foundation Special Physics Award. And his main research interests are computational fluid flow and heat transfer, and microwave assisted transport and processing. So he is going to speak on today the ideas on that. I request him to be
Thanks, Chairman, for introduction, and I would like to take opportunity to thank Professor Ganeshan and Professor Paul to give me opportunity to present some of my work. Actually, my research area is computational fluid flow and heat transfer, and my journey of research started with finite element method, and I found a lot of interesting applications. And one is the heat transfer, and then while I was solving heat transfer, I found that similar kind of equations. So heat transfer, we solve parabolic partial differential equations, and I found the different transport equations like electromagnetic transport, where we can have elliptic partial differential equations, and then we went down to Navier-Stokes equation, we can have parabolic sense, and then I coupled all together parabolic, elliptic, and of course I didn't do much on the hyperbolic, but we have seen a couple of earlier lectures on the hyperbolic PDs. But I will try to see some of the interesting physics on applying, on solving those equations. And today's lecture will be on the microwave propagation. So here I would like to see my focus of the lecture will be the material invariance. That means when we heat up microwave, we actually do microwave heating of food substances. So that's the household application. We all of our house, we have the food substances. This is the classic example of microwave heating. But we have the material processing applications, and for material processing applications, there are applications in metallurgical industries, applications in even biomedical engineering, in fact, for the cancer treatment. So, and the interesting part is what is the driving force of this. So some of the critical issues I would like to discuss here. So let's look at my journey of the talk. So first of all, why microwave? So there are two aspects. One is conventional heating, another is microwave heating. So I would like to see why microwave heating gained so much of attention before going into the mathematical details of the talk. So when you have material, you have heat source, and heat is being actually propagated from the outside, just like a burner, and it's like it is a surface heating. It is heat radiates from the source to the surface, and that's called essentially surface heating. So what actually happens? The hot burner, heat propagates to the body, and the body when it comes to the surface, it's like heat flux, and it propagates based on conductive heat transport. And based on that, we have got gradient, and sometimes what actually happens, we get sometimes hot spots, and we have different kind of liquid medium to cook and the stuff. So basically, it's a surface heating phenomena, and there are a lot of disadvantages. And one of the disadvantages is the non-uniformity of the heating part, and that gives the lesser heating rate of the sample. So when we do the microwave heating, what actually happens, is microwave heating is also the propagation of wave. It's not the heat wave, it's the electromagnetic wave. There's the electric field and magnetic field. They're in perpendicular direction, which is called as uniform plane wave. That's the simplified approximation I made to understand the physics behind the microwave heating. So when microwave propagates, we see these are basically called as dipoles. And and this dipoles basically is dielectric material. When you want to heat up, what actually happens, these dipoles try to orient along the electric field. And an electromagnetic field, when it propagates, it is like a wave, and they also try to orient along the electromagnetic wave. So there are two interesting properties of the material, what is called as dielectric constant, another is called as dielectric loss. So what is dielectric constant? If you, since it's interdisciplinary lecture, I wanted to try my level best to see some kind of pictorial format for this talk. So if you just think about some kind of a spring, just if you expand the spring, if you span quite a lot, you have got a lot of energy in the spring, and that results, if you just release it, it will just bump. That's called dielectric constant. And dielectric loss is very interesting. It's just like if you just rub your hand, what actually happens after some time, you feel heat, and that is dielectric loss. And that's the frictional outcome. So that's the frictional outcome of this dielectric, the dipoles. So dielectric constant is basically ability to convert electromagnetic energy into heat. And these are the two properties, the two interesting properties govern the heating phenomena. Now you can see that these dipoles are actually rotating, dipoles are being distorted, and this phenomenon actually evolve throughout the volume, and that's why it will result the volumetric heating effect, and that's the classic advantage of microwave heating. That's why people use microwave heating, because what will actually happen when electromagnetic wave propagates, every point of the material will act as heat source, and that will not happen when you have the surface of burner heating. Let's see much of the details of this talk. So what I'm going to address here, basically we'll have the two kind of configurations. One is the lateral irradiation and one is the radial irradiation. And what I am planning to show some of the interesting results on the circular cross-section cylinder, a square cross-section cylinder, and if we rotate this square cross-section cylinder, what will happen? So this lateral irradiation is actually this microwave is propagating from one side and the circular sample, and it's like a static configuration. Sometimes it may so happen, we actually put in a microwave burner and the turntable is rotating, and we can simulate the similar kind of situation with the electromagnetic wave propagating from all directions. That is called radial irradiation. So which has got a symmetry if you actually travel along the direction, along this theta direction. So these two configurations, so which we'll actually talk about circular sample, and we'll be talking about the square samples, orientation 1 and 2, and we'll be comparing our results for the samples which will have the same cross-sectional area to appreciate better the heating rate. So how the transport equations. So if you would like to analyze the microwave propagation, the induced electric field we will actually talk about. So for this equation, let me spend some few minutes here for this induced electric field. It comes from the Ampere circuital rule, magnetics, Faraday's law of electromagnetic induction, Gauss's law of electric field, and Gauss's law of magnetic field. If you combine them, you will get Helmholtz equation. And that is our equation you might have seen in our textbook, physics textbooks. Is grad square E plus k square equal to 0, and k is the propagation constant. But I wanted to present the equation in a different format by taking out the typical length scale of the system. The typical length scale means when the microwave propagates, since the wave, of course the typical length scale will be wavelength, one of the wavelength. Another interesting length scale will be called as penetration depth. That means how far microwave can penetrate in the sample. If a sample is a very lossy material, for example meat or water, the penetration depth will not be that much. Suddenly microwave will be absorbed and things will be heated very fast. But if a material is transparent, the penetration depth is like infinity. Okay. For example, air penetration depth is infinity, and that is the way the antenna works. That's the electromagnetic wave is actually used, for all this radar, mobile connections, everything, because of this infinite penetration depth. But in our heating purpose, infinite penetration depth will not be of any use. In that case, microwave cannot be used just for heating. Our objective is for heating of the samples. So what actually I wanted to present this equations to see the typical length scale is coming, which is the wavelength and the penetration depth. So I am actually presenting the mathematical configurations for lateral irradiation and the radial irradiation. So for a lateral irradiation, if you see there's a kind of irregular kind of sample for both the case, and here, as I mentioned, the microwave is propagating from one direction and here for all the directions. And what actually happens here, there is hypothetical circular boundary actually I use for the computation. So this is the point where and since this is the computational science session, I wanted to stress here, and that's why this slide I took almost 90% time I devoted for this slide to give the stress on when you solve this kind of equation of electromagnetic wave propagation. It is not that straightforward to solve a heat equation or Navier-Stokes equation. Of course, the equation is much simpler than Navier-Stokes equation, but the challenge is the boundary condition. Okay, so when you solve it, when you just see the second order differential equation, and we need to have boundary condition. So boundary condition, actually, since we have electric field and magnetic field, that electric field continuity is there. Since we are solving for electric field, we need to have two boundary conditions of electric field. One electric field continuity in the surface, another is the magnetic field continuity, which is in terms of the derivative of the electric field. If you want to look at the fundamentals of electromagnetic propagation, it can be easily seen. Now, the thing is that this boundary condition also termed as a scattering phenomena. Okay, and this, based on the scattering phenomena, what actually happens that for this, so some torque. Okay, so for this scattering phenomena, it has been seen that this electric field, when it is scattered, so that means wave is propagating, hitting a sample, and it gets reflected. Okay, so when it gets reflected, the air medium will have the transmission reflection and as well the sample medium. So effective field will be the transmission field and the electric field, reflected field. The point is, when you have transmission and reflection for this kind of system, and the system for the circular system, it can be easily predictable, which is the Bessel function and Henkel function. But if the sample is even the square domain or the irregular domain, we cannot have Bessel function and Henkel function format. Okay, one can argue on the fact that, okay, I would like to solve numerically, but I can tell you that if you have the circular domain, it is possible to solve the system analytically. So first part of my lecture, what I will do that, I will assume this shape is circular. So in that case, this domain and this domain will be same. And for the circular domain, this is the complicated boundary condition you can see, and you can see Henkel function is coming in picture. So this is the kind of, and this is a sort of, you can see, you can tell mathematically, is a complicated integral differential Robin's boundary condition. It is, of course, Robin's is the most challenging boundary condition, but it is a integral differential Robin's boundary condition. But if you do radial irradiation phenomena, this boundary condition is still Robin's boundary condition, but the integral nature is not there because of the symmetry on this theta direction. So, of course, as I said that for circular domain, it is possible to, even with this type of boundary condition, it is possible to get the closed form solution. I am going to discuss that part in next couple of slides, and next I am going to address the finite element challenges on this problem. If you have irregular domain, how to incorporate it and how to have the different kind of mesh such that this equation has to be satisfied, all the continuity conditions will be satisfied to have the converged solution. So before going to the details of the closed form solution, there's one aspect of this talk to have the material invariance. That means whatever food materials or the other materials we talk about, is it possible to have generalized heating pattern? The answer is yes, and for that purpose, I identified the wavelength, penetration depth, and the free space wavelength. And if you look at, they are the functions of dielectric constant and dielectric loss, and F is the frequency. So what I found that dielectric constant, dielectric loss, and frequency, they are giving the length scale of wavelength, penetration depth, and the free space wavelength. And based on these parameters, actually the function of material dielectric properties, and based on that, I identified 4 groups of material: group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4. And what actually I defined, I have the dimensionless numbers, which are FW, FP. So that is FP is the dimensionless factor for the corresponding to the penetration, and one is for the wavelength. So these are the four things actually I defined. And similarly, we have the wave number that actually talks about the dimensionless material dimensionless length scale, and which have the two asymptotes. One is called thin sample asymptote, another is called a thick sample asymptote, and we have intermediate sample. And these are two types of typical structures we have used. So this FWFP, this will actually give the structure of the dimensionless pattern of the material dependency, and these are the sample dimension dependency. We also have something called penetration number that will give the asymptote. I won't be using this penetration number for the analysis. I will be using FW, FP, and NW to look at my results. So what are the typical values of FP, FW, and FP for the group 1? We have taken the materials on the pinch, and then we have the material for bread. We have the material for the group 2. Group 3 we have put 5 parting, and this is the material we have put for the for another food substances. So these are the typical examples. So now I have the format of the dimensionless pattern of the wave of the equations, and we have lateral irradiation format and radial irradiation format of the boundary conditions, and you can see that all the dimensionless parameters FW, FP, and lambda 0 all are actually coming. So, by using the Poynting vector theorem, one can actually obtain the absorbed power, and with that absorbed power, we can couple with the microwave heating dynamics, that is the volumetric heat generation, and with that, we can actually have overall heating rate. And of course, solutions are obtained by finite element method, but I would like to spend a couple of time on the closed form analysis part. So we have lateral irradiance and radial irradiance, and this is the electric field in terms of the intensity. And electric field is a closed form, which is we have shown the Helmholtz equation, and the closed form you can see for lateral irradiation in terms of the Bessel function, and this is in terms of the Bessel function. But you can see that this is the phi dependency for the one side, and this is symmetry. There is no phi dependency, and you have seen that AN, this kind of, as I said, they are the length scale. We are talking about the material invariants. We have FP, NW, and FW, and we have the absorbed power from here. How much total absorption of the microwave heating, and which will be used as heat generation. This is the expression for the lateral irradiance in the radial irradiance part, and this is the average absorbed power. And this, if you look at this Bn, which is such a complicated function, and this kind of complex closed form, this has been proposed the first time in our work. So let's look at some of the interesting part of our results. So these are the results of the closed form analysis, and this is the average power absorption. The power absorption is the main part. So how much power is being absorbed, and if the power absorption is high, heating rate would be high. So but you see that wave number, which is NW, which is nothing but sample dimension by the wavelength. So it's like a dimensionless sample dimension, and it's very interesting. If you increase the sample dimension, one would expect that if you have large size, the heating rate will be going to decrease, but it is not. If you see that for the lower sample dimension, you get an asymptote. This is called thin sample asymptote, and for the higher sample, you get the thick sample asymptote, where it is actually decreasing with the sample size. But this is something called intermediate zone, where for the lateral and radial, both the cases, you can see some kind of peaks, and these are called as resonance phenomena. And why this resonance phenomena occurs? Because when the microwave propagates, what actually happens? This transmitted field and electric and the deflected field, both will try to interfere, and these actually form the stationary waves. And based on the stationary waves, there are spatial resonances. There is something called constructive interference, and another is called destructive interference. So if you see that the thin sample asymptote in this zone, so I have shown NW equals to 0.22, which is very small, and there you can see lateral and radial will have this thick zone is actually the higher heating effect zone, so we can see only one front. So, and then we have the predictions at NW equals to 0.75 and 1.2. So if you look at NW equals to 0.75, we can see lateral and radial both are actually having the first maxima, and you can see, and for lateral there are 2 maxima, and radial there is 1 maxima. But interesting, if you look at NW NW equals to 1.2. This is the zone, and you can see this kind of fronts, the maxima fronts actually being changed, and there is some kind of interesting pattern about 1.2 and 1.75. We can see multiple heating zones actually will occur for the lateral, but radial it is actually propagating to the center, and this is basically for the symmetry. So these are the phenomena occurring. I am not mentioning here which food material, any silicon carbide, any kind of materials. We just have to have the format. We have to ask what is the value of NW, what is the value of FP, what is the value of FW. See, it is plotted for 0.1 and 0.05. If it is in that zone, this kind of map is presented to you, and with that we have a nice idea how the heating patterns are. So here, this part, I would like to show some of the asymptote for the FP. And if you see that this is a critical value of FP, when FP is going to a critical value, for example, very high value, it will be act as a thick sample. Thick sample means the sample will be, the heating will be occurring from the exposed space if it is, if the microwave is propagating the left side. But when we have the FP is less, actually what you can see that we don't we have some kind of multiple fronts, and the heating propagates will be from the center. But when FP is very high value, the heating actually will be propagating from the surface. So we have found some kind of interesting multiple heating fronts. That means where the heating actually being started is not the heating started from the one. So that means it is showing some kind of spatial resonances in the heating pattern, and that has been the outcome for this kind of heating simulations. So let's talk about the effect of FW. And FW, there is some interesting phenomena. We have found there are different some asymptotes. For example, FW is 0.001. These asymptotes, what actually will happen, if you look at for all the regimes of NW, we can see lateral and radial almost similar. And it says that, if you have a material, FW, very low FW, in that case, doesn't matter, we have lateral or radial, and this will give the similar kind of phenomena. Whereas, if you have FW equals to 1, you can see lateral will be going to the thick sample limit for whatever NW you choose, and radial will have the multiple zone. So with this kind of asymptotes, we'll have the idea of the various limits, and fundamentally, this has been predicted first time with the closed form analysis. So, and then I wanted to highlight the applications. We have picked up bread, potato, beef, shrimp, and silicon carbide. And these are actually, of course, the food samples, but there are a lot of interesting physics because of the values of the FW and FP, what I have highlighted here. And we can see that whatever we have predicted about different kind of zones, that has been shown here with the different values of NW 0.75 and 1.2. And we can see the microwave power here, and the temperature profiles, and we have seen the decreasing of the resonance of the hotspots. So far we have shown some of the closed form, and here is the part where we wanted to highlight the finite element part. So when we have this kind of domain, it is difficult to implement the boundary condition at the surface. So in that case, the computational strategy is to have the hypothetical circular surface such that boundary condition is implemented here. What is this hypothetical surface? This hypothetical surface is air. So we can actually consider air layer. Air is there always, and air is having dielectric constant 1 and dielectric loss equal to 0. And why actually have circular surface here? It is mathematically very simple, because we have the orthogonality criteria, and that orthogonality criteria can be easily implemented, and so that we can implement peacefully the Bessel function and the Henkel function stuff. So the two structures actually I considered, and this is the typical finite element mesh. We have inbuilt finite element code. We have actually used this type of mesh, and what actually happened, we have the mesh consistency check, and we calculate we evaluate the mesh determinant, and then if the determinant is greater than 0, then